There was once a woman who spent so much of her life caring for everyone around her that she slowly disappeared from her own sight. No one noticed it at first, not even her, because disappearance in the human soul rarely happens all at once. It happens quietly. It happens through 1,000 small sacrifices that seem noble in the moment. It happens every time someone asks for a little more and she says yes when she means no. Every time she puts her own hunger aside because someone else's need feels more urgent. Every time she becomes the bridge, the shelter, the listener, the healer, the one who remembers birthdays, smooths conflicts, absorbs disappointments, and carries emotional weight that was never hers to carry. The strange thing is that the world often rewards this kind of vanishing. People praise her generosity. They admire her patience. They call her selfless. And so she learns a dangerous lesson, that her value is measured by how much of herself she can give away. At first it feels meaningful. To be needed feels like purpose. To be depended upon feels like love. To be indispensable feels like belonging. But there is a hidden cost to becoming everyone's refuge. A refuge is rarely asked whether it needs shelter itself, and so years pass, sometimes decades. The woman continues pouring water into every thirsty cup around her, never noticing that her own well is running dry. Then one day something unexpected happens. Nothing dramatic, no lightning bolt, no grand tragedy. Perhaps she simply wakes up one morning and feels tired in a way sleep cannot fix. Perhaps she hears herself laugh and realizes the sound feels unfamiliar. Perhaps she catches her reflection in a window and has the unsettling sensation of looking at a stranger. And suddenly a question emerges from somewhere deep beneath the layers of obligation. What happened to me? It is one of the most frightening questions a person can ask. Because beneath it lives another question. Who am I when I am not taking care of everyone else? Many people spend their entire lives avoiding this question, not because they lack courage, but because identity can become entangled with service. The woman no longer knows where her responsibilities end and where her self begins. Her life has become like a garden she tended for everyone except herself. The flowers around her bloom beautifully. Meanwhile, the gardener stands exhausted, wondering why she feels empty despite all she has given. Human beings possess a remarkable ability to adapt. We adapt to difficult relationships. We adapt to neglect. We adapt to imbalance. We adapt so well that eventually we stop recognizing it as imbalance at all. What once would have felt unfair begins to feel normal. What once would have felt exhausting begins to feel expected. And the soul, desperate to preserve harmony, learns to silence its own signals. But silenced needs do not disappear. They wait, they gather, they accumulate in the hidden rooms of the psyche. Sometimes they emerge as resentment, sometimes as anxiety, sometimes as sadness with no obvious source, and sometimes as a quiet loneliness that persists even when surrounded by people. Because there is a loneliness that comes not from being unseen by others, but from being unseen by yourself. The woman who forgot she was also a person often lives inside this loneliness. She knows everyone else's stories, everyone else's struggles, everyone else's dreams, yet when asked about her own, she hesitates. The answer feels distant, as though she is searching through fog. This is not weakness. It is the consequence of years spent directing attention outward while neglecting the inner landscape. Imagine carrying a lantern through the night. For years you use its light to guide everyone else. You illuminate their paths. You help them avoid obstacles. You help them find their way. But eventually you realize something astonishing. You have never turned the lantern toward yourself, and so the journey back begins. Not toward a new self, toward the self that was waiting all along. This return is rarely comfortable. The world often celebrates self-sacrifice more than self-discovery. When the woman begins setting boundaries, some people become confused. When she says no, others may feel disappointed. When she prioritizes her own well-being, those accustomed to her endless availability may interpret it as selfishness. But growth often looks selfish to people who benefited from your lack of boundaries. This is one of the hardest truths to accept. A healthy life requires a healthy center, and a person without a center becomes vulnerable to being defined entirely by external demands. The woman begins asking unfamiliar questions. What do I enjoy? What do I believe? What do I need? What am I feeling? At first, the answers arrive slowly, like birds cautiously returning after a storm. She rediscovers forgotten passions, old dreams, unspoken desires, pieces of herself she abandoned in exchange for approval, harmony, or belonging. And something beautiful begins to happen. She realizes that caring for herself does not diminish her ability to care for others. In fact, it deepens it. Love given from fullness feels different from love given from depletion. One nourishes, the other drains. One is a gift, the other becomes a sacrifice that eventually breeds exhaustion. the woman starts understanding a profound truth. She was never meant to be a machine that produces care. She was meant to be a human being who experiences life, who feels joy, who rests, who creates, who dreams, who matters, not because of what she does for others, not because of how much she gives, not because of how useful she can be, but because she exists. This realization changes everything. For years she believed her worth had to be earned. Now she begins discovering that worth is not a reward. It is a birthright. The river does not earn its value by watering the land. The sun does not earn its value by providing light. A human soul does not earn its value by exhausting itself in service. Its value is inherent, unconditional, already present. The greatest transformation is not becoming someone new. It is remembering who you were before the world convinced you that your needs were less important than everyone else's. And perhaps that is the hidden tragedy of so many lives. Not that people fail to love others, but that they forget they belong among the people they are responsible for loving. The woman who forgot she was also a person eventually discovers something extraordinary. The list of people she must care for always contained one more name, her own. And the moment she finally adds herself to that list is not the moment she becomes selfish. It is the moment she becomes whole. Because the deepest wisdom is not learning how to give everything away. The deepest wisdom is realizing that you were never meant to disappear inside your love for others. You were meant to stand within it too. And in the end, the most important relationship you will ever heal is not the relationship between you and the world. It is the relationship between you and the forgotten person who has been waiting quietly inside you all along. The person who, despite years of neglect, never stopped hoping that one day you would remember you were also someone worth saving. There is a kind of disappearance that leaves no missing person report, no dramatic farewell, no visible evidence that someone has gone. It happens in plain sight. It happens while a woman continues showing up every day, smiling when expected, fulfilling responsibilities, answering messages, solving problems, and taking care of the endless needs that surround her. To everyone else she appears present, yet somewhere along the way she has begun to vanish from her own life. The process is so gradual that it rarely attracts attention. It begins with small acts of love. She stays up a little later to help someone through a difficult moment. She postpones her own plans to support a friend. She puts her feelings aside because someone else's crisis seems more urgent. These choices often come from a genuine place of compassion. There is nothing wrong with caring deeply. The problem arises when care becomes a one-way road, when every act of giving moves her further away from herself. Over time, she learns that being dependable earns appreciation. People come to trust her. They rely on her strength, her patience, her understanding. She becomes the person others call when they are overwhelmed, confused, heartbroken, or lost. At first, this role feels meaningful. It gives her a sense of purpose. It reassures her that she matters. Yet hidden beneath this role is a subtle danger. The more she becomes known for what she provides, the less she remembers who she is beyond those contributions. Many women are taught, directly or indirectly, that goodness means self-sacrifice. They absorb messages that encourage them to be accommodating, nurturing, and endlessly available. They become skilled at reading the emotional temperature of every room they enter. They notice everyone's discomfort before their own. They become experts at anticipating needs while ignoring the quiet signals coming from within themselves. The soul, however, keeps a record. Every postponed dream leaves a mark. Every swallowed emotion settles somewhere beneath awareness. Every ignored desire waits patiently in the shadows. The woman may continue functioning perfectly on the outside, yet internally she begins feeling disconnected from something essential. She cannot quite explain it. She only knows that despite doing everything she is supposed to do, a strange emptiness follows her. She may look around at the life she has built and wonder why fulfillment feels so distant. After all, she has given so much. She has been responsible, caring, reliable. Yet there is a difference between living a life and managing one. There is a difference between being needed and being known, especially by yourself. The tragedy is not that she loves others too much. The tragedy is that somewhere along the way, she unconsciously removed herself from the circle of people deserving her care. Her attention became so focused on supporting everyone else's journey that she stopped asking where her own path was leading. She became the caretaker of countless lives while neglecting the relationship that needed her presence most, the relationship with herself. What makes this disappearance especially painful is that it often looks admirable from the outside. Society praises devotion. It celebrates sacrifice. It applauds those who carry heavy burdens without complaint. Few people stop to ask what has been surrendered in the process. Few notice the dreams that were quietly abandoned, the needs that were repeatedly dismissed, or the identity that slowly faded beneath layers of responsibility. And so the woman continues moving through life, unaware that the person she has been searching for, the person she misses without fully understanding why, is not lost somewhere in the world. She is the one who slowly disappeared while trying to be everything for everyone else. There is a subtle moment in many lives when being needed begins to feel indistinguishable from being loved. It rarely announces itself. No one wakes up one morning and consciously decides to build their identity around meeting the needs of others. Instead, it develops quietly through years of experiences, relationships, expectations, and emotional conditioning. A woman learns that when she helps, comforts, supports, and sacrifices, she receives appreciation, acceptance, and connection. Over time, these experiences create an invisible equation in her mind. If I am needed, I matter. At first, this belief can feel empowering. Being reliable gives life structure. It creates a sense of purpose. Knowing that others depend on her can make her feel valuable and important. She becomes the person people trust, the one who remembers details, the one who stays calm during crises, the one who carries emotional burdens without asking for recognition. Her ability to care becomes one of her greatest strengths. But every strength carries a shadow when it becomes the foundation of identity. The problem begins when her sense of self becomes attached not to who she is, but to what she provides. Her worth slowly shifts from being inherent to being conditional. Instead of believing she deserves love simply because she exists, she starts believing she deserves love because she is useful, because she solves problems, because she sacrifices, because she gives. This creates a quiet but powerful fear. If people no longer need me, who am I? The question often remains hidden beneath consciousness, yet it influences countless decisions. It explains why some women struggle to say no even when they are exhausted. It explains why they continue giving after their emotional resources have been depleted. It explains why rest can sometimes feel uncomfortable, even undeserved. When identity becomes tied to usefulness, moments of stillness can feel strangely threatening. A woman may find herself constantly searching for ways to contribute, fix, organize, support, or rescue, not because others demand it, but because these actions reassure her that she has value. Her role becomes her reflection. Her responsibilities become proof of her existence. Yet identity built entirely upon external needs is fragile. The needs of others constantly change. Relationships evolve. Children grow up. Friends become independent. Careers shift. Circumstances transform. When life inevitably changes, the woman may suddenly feel disoriented. The roles that once defined her begin to loosen, and she discovers something unsettling. She knows far more about everyone else's desires than her own. Many people spend years becoming experts on the emotional landscapes of others while remaining strangers to themselves. They know how to comfort someone through grief but cannot identify their own sadness. They know how to encourage someone else's dreams, but struggle to remember their own. They know how to make space for everyone else's feelings while quietly dismissing their own inner world. The deeper issue is that constant usefulness can become a distraction from self-discovery. When attention is always directed outward, there is little opportunity to explore the questions that shape a genuine identity. What brings me joy? What do I believe? What inspires me? What kind of life do I want? These questions require stillness, honesty, and self-attention. Qualities that often disappear when a person becomes consumed by serving others. Eventually, a painful realization emerges. Being needed is not the same as being known. Being useful is not the same as being loved. And carrying responsibility is not the same as having a strong sense of self. True identity cannot be built solely on what a person does for others. It must also include who they are when nobody is asking for anything. It must survive moments of solitude, seasons of change, and periods when there is nothing to fix. Because beneath every role, every responsibility, and every act of service exists a human being whose value extends far beyond usefulness, a person waiting to discover that their existence alone is enough. There is a particular kind of loneliness that many people never speak about because it is difficult to explain. It is not the loneliness of an empty room. It is not the loneliness that comes from lacking relationships or companionship. In fact, it can exist in a life filled with family, friends, conversations, responsibilities, and constant interaction. It is the loneliness that emerges when a person becomes disconnected from themselves. The woman who has spent years caring for others often knows this loneliness intimately. From the outside, her life may appear full. People seek her advice. They trust her. They confide in her. She is surrounded by voices, requests, expectations, and connections. Yet beneath all of this activity, there is a quiet feeling that something essential is missing. The strange thing about self-abandonment is that it rarely feels dramatic. It happens through countless ordinary moments. Every time she ignores her own feelings because someone else's emotions seem more important. Every time she silences a need because meeting it feels inconvenient. Every time she chooses harmony over honesty. accommodation over authenticity, or responsibility over personal fulfillment. At first, these choices seem harmless. They may even appear generous and mature. But over time, a subtle distance begins to grow between the woman and her inner world. Her thoughts, desires, fears, and dreams become less familiar. She becomes highly attuned to the emotional lives of others while slowly losing contact with her own. Imagine living in a house with many rooms but spending years locked in only one corner. The rest of the house still exists, but it gathers dust in silence. Forgotten rooms become unfamiliar. Hidden spaces remain unexplored. Eventually, you stop remembering what was there in the first place. The human psyche works in much the same way. Every person contains an inner landscape rich with emotions, creativity, intuition, curiosity, longing, and wisdom. Yet when life becomes centered entirely around external demands, this inner landscape is neglected. The woman becomes so occupied with managing relationships and responsibilities that she stops visiting the deeper parts of herself. This creates a profound sense of loneliness because genuine connection requires presence. Not just presence with others, but presence with oneself. Many people assume loneliness is caused by a lack of relationships. Sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes loneliness persists because relationships have become substitutes for self-connection rather than expressions of it. A woman may spend her entire day responding to the needs of others and still go to bed feeling unseen. The reason is not that others have failed to see her. The reason is that she has stopped seeing herself. Her feelings become background noise. Her dreams become postponed plans. Her desires become optional considerations. Her exhaustion becomes normal. Her sadness becomes something to push through. Gradually, she begins existing more as a role than as a person. She becomes the caretaker, the partner, the mother, the friend, the helper, the professional. These roles are important, but they are not the entirety of who she is. Yet when identity becomes consumed by roles, the deeper self struggles to breathe. The loneliness that follows often appears in unexpected ways. It may emerge as a vague dissatisfaction that cannot be explained. It may show up as restlessness, emotional numbness, chronic fatigue, or a persistent sense that life feels disconnected from its original meaning. She may find herself asking questions she cannot easily answer. Why do I feel empty? Why am I unhappy when everything seems fine? Why do I feel invisible even when people appreciate me? These questions point toward an important truth. The soul cannot thrive on external validation alone. No amount of appreciation, praise, or gratitude can replace the experience of knowing oneself. No relationship can fully compensate for the absence of a relationship with one's own inner life. The human spirit longs not only to be loved by others, but also to be recognized by the person living inside it. The deepest loneliness is not being physically alone. It is waking up one day and realizing you have spent so much time attending to everyone else's existence that you have become a stranger to your own. And the path out of that loneliness begins the moment you become willing to listen again to the quiet voice within that has been waiting patiently and faithfully for your return. There comes a moment in many lives when outward effort is no longer enough. The routines continue, the responsibilities remain, the obligations are still fulfilled. Yet something inside begins to whisper that there is another journey waiting to be taken. Not a journey across countries or through distant landscapes, but a journey inward. A journey toward the self that has been neglected, overlooked, or forgotten. For a woman who has spent years directing her energy toward others, this inward turn can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. She has become accustomed to focusing her attention outward. She notices other people's moods before her own. She anticipates their needs, solves their problems, and carries their concerns. Her awareness is constantly scanning the external world. But one day she realizes that she has been holding a lantern her entire life and using its light exclusively for everyone else's path. The realization is both painful and liberating. She begins to see that while she has helped many people navigate darkness, she has rarely illuminated her own inner world. There are entire parts of herself she has not visited in years. Old dreams sit quietly in forgotten corners. Suppressed emotions wait patiently beneath the surface. Talents, desires, and longings that once felt alive have become distant memories. Turning the lantern inward means choosing to look at what has been avoided. This is not always a pleasant process. Many people imagine self-discovery as a beautiful and inspiring experience, but genuine self-discovery often begins with honesty, and honesty can be unsettling. The woman may discover how exhausted she truly is. She may recognize resentment she has spent years denying. She may uncover grief for opportunities missed, boundaries violated, or parts of herself sacrificed in the pursuit of being everything for everyone. These discoveries are not signs of failure. They are signs of awakening. The emotions that surface are not enemies. They are messengers. They carry information about needs that have gone unmet and truths that have remained unspoken. For years, she may have treated her inner world as something secondary, something to attend to later, but later eventually arrives, and when it does, the neglected parts of the self begin asking to be seen. At first, listening can feel strange. She may not know what she enjoys anymore. She may struggle to identify what she truly wants. So much of her life has been shaped by expectations and responsibilities that her own preferences seem buried beneath layers of conditioning. Questions that sound simple suddenly become difficult. What makes me feel alive? What am I curious about? What do I need? What do I feel? The answers rarely arrive immediately. They emerge slowly, like stars becoming visible after sunset. The more attention she gives herself, the clearer they become. Small moments of self-reflection begin revealing things she had forgotten. A passion abandoned years ago, a dream dismissed as unrealistic, a part of her personality hidden to avoid criticism or rejection. As she continues turning the lantern inward, she discovers that self-awareness is not selfishness. It is responsibility. Just as a gardener must understand the condition of the soil before expecting healthy growth, a person must understand themselves before creating a meaningful life. The inward journey also requires courage because it means confronting contradictions. She may realize that some choices were made from fear rather than desire. Some relationships were maintained out of obligation rather than connection. Some sacrifices were unnecessary. These truths can be difficult to face, yet they create the possibility for change. Gradually, the woman begins forming a new relationship with herself. She stops treating her emotions as inconveniences and starts treating them as valuable signals. She stops dismissing her needs and begins respecting them. She learns to sit with her own thoughts rather than constantly distracting herself through activity and service. The lantern that once illuminated only the lives of others now shines upon her own path. And in that light she discovers something remarkable. She was never truly lost. The person she has been searching for was always there, waiting patiently beneath years of neglect, hoping that one day she would finally turn toward herself and see what had been there all along. Few words create more discomfort than the word boundary. For many women, it carries an invisible burden of guilt. The moment they consider saying no, protecting their time, expressing a need, or limiting what they are willing to give, an uncomfortable feeling arises. A voice inside may whisper that they are being difficult, unkind, selfish, or uncaring. Yet this belief is often one of the greatest obstacles to genuine wholeness. Many people grow up believing that love means constant availability. They learn that kindness requires endless sacrifice, and that good people should always put others first. Over time, they begin measuring their worth by how much they can tolerate, how much they can endure, and how much they can give away. The ability to accommodate everyone becomes a source of pride, but what appears generous on the surface can sometimes conceal a painful reality underneath. Without boundaries, a person slowly loses contact with where they end and others begin. Imagine a house without walls. Anyone can enter at any time. There is no protection from storms, no privacy, no place to rest, and no sense of ownership over the space. The house remains exposed to every demand, every intrusion, and every external force. Eventually, it becomes impossible to distinguish between what belongs inside and what belongs outside. The human psyche functions in much the same way. Boundaries are not barriers designed to keep love out. They are structures that allow love to exist in a healthy form. They create clarity. They establish respect. They define responsibility. They help a person recognize what belongs to them and what does not. A woman who lacks boundaries often carries burdens that were never hers to carry. She absorbs emotions she cannot control. She takes responsibility for other people's choices. She feels obligated to solve problems that do not belong to her. Gradually, her life becomes crowded with responsibilities that drain her energy while leaving little room for her own growth. The tragedy is that she may not even realize it is happening, because when a pattern has existed for years, it begins to feel normal. She becomes accustomed to overextending herself. She learns to ignore exhaustion. She dismisses her own needs because there is always something or someone demanding attention. The result is not greater love. The result is depletion. When she finally begins establishing boundaries, the experience can feel frightening. She may worry about disappointing people. She may fear rejection or conflict. She may feel responsible for emotions that arise in others when expectations change. This fear is understandable. For years, her identity may have been connected to being available, helpful, and accommodating. Changing that pattern feels like stepping into unfamiliar territory, yet growth often requires entering spaces that initially feel uncomfortable. The first boundary is rarely dramatic. Sometimes it is as simple as saying, "I can't do that right now." Sometimes it is choosing rest without explaining or apologizing. Sometimes it is refusing to carry emotional burdens that belong to someone else. Sometimes it is recognizing that another person's disappointment is not automatically evidence of wrongdoing. Each boundary becomes a declaration of self-respect, not because it diminishes care for others, but because it includes care for oneself. This distinction is crucial. Healthy boundaries do not reduce compassion, they strengthen it. A person who constantly gives beyond their capacity eventually becomes exhausted, resentful, or emotionally numb. Their generosity turns into obligation. Their care becomes mechanical. What once flowed naturally begins to feel heavy. True compassion requires sustainability. A tree cannot provide shade if its roots are dying. A well cannot offer water if it has run dry. Likewise, a person cannot continuously nurture others while neglecting their own well-being. As boundaries become stronger, something remarkable happens. The woman begins discovering that her needs matter, her time has value, her energy is finite, her feelings deserve attention. She no longer sees herself as existing solely in service to others. Instead, she begins recognizing herself as a whole human being with legitimate desires, limits, and priorities. The deepest purpose of boundaries is not separation, it is integration. They allow a person to remain connected to others without abandoning themselves. They create the conditions for relationships built on mutual respect rather than silent sacrifice. And through that process, the woman gradually learns that protecting her own well-being is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of wisdom, dignity, and self-respect that makes genuine wholeness possible. The most profound transformations in life often begin not with discovering something new, but with remembering something that was always true. There comes a moment when the woman who has spent years caring for everyone else finally sees a reality that had been hidden in plain sight. It is not a complicated truth. It is not a secret reserved for the wise. Yet its simplicity makes it easy to overlook. She belongs among the people she loves. For much of her life, she may have unconsciously placed herself outside that circle. There were the people who needed support, encouragement, patience, forgiveness, understanding, and care. Then there was her. She became the provider of these things rather than a recipient of them. She stood at the edge of her own compassion, extending it outward in every direction while rarely allowing any of it to return to her. This pattern can become so familiar that it feels natural. When someone is hurt, she offers comfort. When someone is afraid, she offers reassurance. When someone makes a mistake, she offers understanding. When someone is exhausted, she tells them to rest. Yet when she experiences the same struggles, the standards often change. She becomes harsher with herself, less forgiving, less patient. She expects herself to carry burdens that she would never ask another person to carry. She grants grace to everyone except the person who needs it most. This contradiction reveals something important about human nature. Many people find it easier to extend kindness outward than inward. Compassion for others feels noble. Compassion for oneself can feel uncomfortable, undeserved, or even selfish. But this belief creates a painful division within the self. It treats one human being as worthy of care while excluding another. And that excluded person is often the one looking back from the mirror. The journey toward wholeness begins when this division starts to dissolve. The woman slowly realizes that the love she offers others contains lessons she has never fully applied to herself. She understands how to comfort a grieving friend but struggles to acknowledge her own grief. She knows how to encourage someone else's growth but criticizes her own imperfections. She tells others they are enough while secretly believing she must constantly earn her worth. One day, perhaps through reflection, exhaustion, loss, or simple awakening, she begins asking a different question. What if I deserve the same compassion I freely give to everyone else? The question sounds small, but its implications are enormous. Because if the answer is yes, then everything changes. Suddenly, rest is no longer a reward for exhaustion but a human necessity. Boundaries are no longer acts of selfishness but expressions of self-respect. Mistakes become opportunities for learning rather than evidence of failure. Needs become signals to honor rather than weaknesses to suppress. The woman starts recognizing that she has spent years acting as though her humanity was somehow different from everyone else's. She treated herself as an exception to the very principles of care and understanding she believed in. Yet she is subject to the same realities as every other person. She becomes tired. She becomes afraid. She experiences loss, uncertainty, disappointment, and pain. Why then should she deserve less kindness? This realization does not inflate the ego. It softens the heart. It allows her to stop fighting herself. For years, she may have viewed self-care as something that had to be justified. Now she begins seeing it as something natural, not because she is more important than others, but because she is not less important either. There is a quiet dignity in this understanding. The woman no longer measures her value by productivity, usefulness, or sacrifice. She no longer believes that her needs must always come last. She no longer views herself as the caretaker standing outside the circle, responsible for everyone else's well-being while neglecting her own. Instead, she takes her rightful place within the circle of her own compassion. She becomes both the giver and the recipient of kindness, both the nurturer and the nurtured, both the protector and the protected. And in doing so, she remembers something that had been forgotten beneath years of responsibility, expectation, and self-neglect. She was never meant to spend her life proving that she deserved love. She was always meant to understand that she was one of the people love was meant for. One of the deepest illusions a person can carry is the belief that their worth must be earned. It is an idea so common that many people never question it. They grow up believing that value comes from achievement, approval, usefulness, sacrifice, or perfection. They learn to associate love with performance and acceptance with meeting expectations. Over time, they begin treating their existence like a contract, constantly searching for ways to prove that they deserve the space they occupy in the world. For the woman who has spent much of her life giving to others, this belief can become especially powerful. She may not consciously think, "I must earn my worth." Yet her actions reveal the story she has been living. She says yes when she is exhausted. She overextends herself to avoid disappointing people. She feels guilty when resting. She measures her value by how much she accomplishes, how many people she helps, or how little trouble she causes. Beneath all of this lies a quiet fear. If I stop proving my value, will I still matter? This question influences more lives than most people realize. It drives perfectionism. It fuels burnout. It creates anxiety around failure and makes people feel responsible for meeting impossible standards. The individual becomes trapped in an endless cycle of earning, striving, and performing, hoping that the next achievement or act of sacrifice will finally provide a lasting sense of worth. Yet the satisfaction never lasts. A compliment fades. An accomplishment becomes old news. A goal is replaced by another goal. A responsibility gives way to a new responsibility. The person keeps running because they are trying to fill an emptiness that achievement alone cannot fill. The truth is both simple and revolutionary. Worth is not something that can be earned because it is not something that was ever missing. Consider how we view nature. A mountain does not need to justify its existence. A river does not wake each morning wondering whether it has done enough to deserve flowing toward the sea. A tree does not earn its right to grow by proving its usefulness. Their value is inherent. It exists before accomplishment, before contribution, before recognition. Human beings often forget this truth about themselves. They create conditions for their own worthiness. They tell themselves they will be enough when they become more successful, more attractive, more productive, more selfless, or more accomplished. But every condition creates another condition. The finish line keeps moving because the problem was never a lack of worth. The problem was a lack of recognition. For the woman who is rediscovering herself, this realization changes everything. She begins to understand that her value is not dependent on how much she gives. It does not rise when she succeeds or disappear when she struggles. It is not increased by praise or diminished by criticism. It exists beneath all circumstances. This understanding creates a new kind of freedom. She no longer needs to exhaust herself proving that she deserves care. She no longer treats mistakes as evidence of inadequacy. She no longer believes that every flaw must be corrected before she can accept herself. Instead, she begins relating to herself with a deeper sense of dignity. She sees that being human was never a problem that needed solving. Her imperfections do not cancel her worth. Her limitations do not reduce her value. Her needs do not make her burdensome. Her existence alone carries significance. And perhaps the most healing moment of all arrives when she finally stops asking, "What must I do to be enough?" and begins understanding that the question itself was built upon a misunderstanding. She was searching for proof of something that had been true from the very beginning. She was never becoming worthy. She was simply remembering that she already was. There is a quiet difference between surviving a life and truly inhabiting it. Many people spend years moving from obligation to obligation, fulfilling responsibilities, meeting expectations, and doing what is necessary to keep everything functioning. They become skilled at endurance. They learn how to carry weight. They learn how to keep going even when they are tired. Yet somewhere beneath all that strength, a deeper question waits patiently. Am I actually living, or am I simply managing my existence? For the woman who spent years forgetting herself, this question becomes impossible to ignore. There was a time when her days were filled almost entirely with reactions. Someone needed something. A problem appeared. An expectation arose. A responsibility demanded attention. Her energy flowed outward in response to the needs of the world around her. Life became a series of responses rather than a conscious expression of who she was. Without realizing it, she stopped becoming the author of her own story. Instead, she became an editor of everyone else's. She revised plans, solved conflicts, softened disappointments, and carried emotional burdens. Her life revolved around maintenance. She maintained relationships, maintained stability, maintained appearances, maintained peace. But maintenance is not the same as meaning. A house can be maintained for years while remaining empty. A garden can be watered while never producing the flowers the gardener truly wanted to grow. Likewise, a person can spend decades fulfilling duties while neglecting the deeper callings of their own soul. One day, the woman begins noticing something she had overlooked for years. Beneath her responsibilities, there are desires she never fully explored. Beneath her roles, there is a personality waiting to be expressed. Beneath the version of herself that everyone depends upon, there is another self longing not merely to survive life but to experience it. This realization can feel both exciting and frightening, because genuine living requires choice, and choice requires accepting responsibility for one's own desires. For years, it may have felt easier to focus on what others needed because it provided clarity. The needs of others were obvious. Her own needs were less familiar. Now she faces questions that have no simple answers. What brings me alive? What would I pursue if no one expected anything from me? What kind of experiences do I want before my life is over? What parts of myself have been waiting for permission to emerge? These questions shift her attention from obligation toward possibility. Gradually, she begins allowing herself to explore rather than merely perform. She rediscovers interests she abandoned long ago. She makes space for curiosity. She experiences moments of joy that are not connected to productivity or usefulness. She learns that existence is not solely about giving, fixing, helping, or sacrificing. It is also about experiencing, about creating, about feeling wonder, about expressing one's unique voice. For perhaps the first time in years, she begins making decisions that are not based entirely on guilt, expectation, or duty. She listens to her own instincts. She honors her own preferences. She trusts her own inner compass. This does not mean she stops caring for others. Rather, she stops disappearing while doing so. She learns that a meaningful life is not built by constantly abandoning oneself in service of external demands. It is built by bringing one's full self into the world. Not a diminished self, not an exhausted self, not a forgotten self, a whole self. And as she steps more fully into her own life, she discovers a truth that changes everything. The purpose of her existence was never to spend her years standing in the background of everyone else's story. She was meant to become a living, breathing participant in her own story as well. In that realization, life stops feeling like something she must endure and begins feeling like something she is finally ready to embrace. There were originally only 6 keynote headings in the outline. If you're continuing the series and need a ***9 Uffring keynote ***, here's an expansion based on the speech's core theme, the life that begins when you stop abandoning yourself. For many years, the woman believed that abandoning herself was simply part of being a good person. She thought love meant putting herself last. She thought strength meant enduring more than she should. She thought maturity meant carrying burdens quietly and asking for very little in return. She did not recognize self-abandonment because it had become woven into the fabric of her daily life. It appeared in the promises she made to others while breaking promises to herself. It appeared in the dreams she postponed because there was always something more urgent. It appeared in the exhaustion she ignored, the emotions she dismissed, and the needs she convinced herself could wait another day, and then another day, and another. Years can pass this way. A person can become so accustomed to neglecting themselves that it feels normal. They stop noticing the quiet betrayals. They stop recognizing the cost. They continue moving forward, unaware that every act of self-abandonment creates a little more distance between who they are and who they could become. Yet something within the human spirit is remarkably persistent. No matter how long it has been ignored, a deeper self continues waiting. It waits beneath obligations, beneath expectations, beneath fear, beneath the countless roles a person plays, and eventually that waiting becomes impossible to ignore. Perhaps it arrives as restlessness, perhaps as sadness, perhaps as a feeling that life has become strangely empty despite all the responsibilities being fulfilled. The woman begins realizing that the pain she feels is not evidence that something is wrong with her. It is evidence that an important part of her has been asking for attention. This realization marks the beginning of a new chapter, not because her circumstances instantly change, not because her problems disappear, but because she stops abandoning herself. She starts listening when she feels tired. She pays attention when something feels wrong. She honors her emotions instead of suppressing them. She treats her inner world as something worthy of care. At first, these changes seem small, almost insignificant, yet they create profound shifts. Every time she chooses honesty over people-pleasing, she returns to herself. Every time she respects a boundary, she returns to herself. Every time she acknowledges a desire, a feeling, or a dream that she once dismissed, she returns to herself. The journey is not about becoming someone different. It is about ending a lifelong habit of leaving oneself behind. Gradually, she discovers that life feels different when she is present within it. Colors seem brighter. Moments feel richer. Relationships become more authentic. There is less resentment because there is less self-betrayal. There is less exhaustion because there is less unnecessary sacrifice. There is less loneliness because she is no longer abandoning her own company. The most beautiful part of this transformation is that it does not make her less loving. It makes her love more honestly, more sustainably, more freely. Because when a person stops abandoning themselves, they no longer give from emptiness, they give from presence. And that is when life truly begins. Not the life built around expectations, obligations, or endless proving, but the life that emerges when a person finally decides that they will no longer leave themselves behind. The day she stops abandoning herself is the day she stops merely surviving her life and starts fully living it. At some point in her journey, the woman comes to a realization that does not arrive with drama, but with stillness. It is not a loud revelation. It does not break her life apart. Instead, it quietly reorders everything she thought she understood about love, responsibility, and existence itself. She begins to understand that she was never meant to disappear inside her care for others. For so long she believed that love required self-erasure. That to be good, she must be endlessly available. That to be meaningful, she must always be useful. That to be accepted, she must constantly give, adjust, and accommodate. These beliefs did not form overnight. They were shaped slowly, through repetition, expectation, praise for sacrifice, and subtle reinforcement that her value increased when she neglected herself. But now she starts seeing the hidden cost of that belief. A life built on self-erasure eventually creates distance from the self, and distance, when it becomes too large, turns into silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of disconnection. She remembers moments when she said yes while something inside her whispered no. She remembers times she smiled while feeling depleted. She remembers how often she carried emotional weight that was never hers, convincing herself it was kindness when it was actually disappearance. And yet, she also begins to see something else, that her intentions were never wrong. She was not weak. She was not careless. She was not unkind. She was simply trying to belong, trying to maintain connection, trying to preserve love in the only way she knew at the time. This understanding softens everything, because healing does not begin with self-judgment. It begins with self-recognition. She starts to see that love was never meant to demand her disappearance. Real love does not require someone to shrink, suppress, or erase themselves in order to be accepted. Real love allows presence. It allows truth. It allows a person to exist fully without fear of losing connection. And slowly, she begins to redefine what it means to love. She no longer sees love as something proven through exhaustion. She no longer equates sacrifice with worthiness. She no longer confuses being needed with being loved. Instead, she begins to understand love as something that expands rather than diminishes the self. Something that allows two whole people to exist without one of them vanishing. This shift changes the way she relates to the world. She starts noticing when she is disappearing again. Not in dramatic ways, but in subtle ones. In the hesitation before expressing her needs. In the automatic yes that follows someone else's request. In the quiet suppression of her own feelings to avoid discomfort. And each time she notices, she has a choice, to continue the pattern, or to return to herself. This return is not always easy. It requires awareness. It requires courage. It requires the willingness to disappoint others in order to remain honest with herself. But with each small act of return, something begins to strengthen within her. A sense of inner stability. A sense of self that does not depend entirely on external approval. A sense that she is allowed to exist as she is, not just as she is needed. And over time, something remarkable becomes clear. The more she stops disappearing, the more authentic her connections become. Because she is no longer meeting people from a place of emptiness or obligation. She is meeting them from presence, from truth, from wholeness. She realizes that she was never meant to be a shadow in her own life, shaped entirely by the needs of others. She was meant to be fully present within it, not as an object of service but as a living, breathing human being who belongs in her own experience. And in that final understanding, everything she once believed about love transformed. She no longer asks, how much of myself must I give away to be loved? Instead, she begins to live the question she was always meant to ask. What becomes possible when I refuse to disappear? The 11th realization arrives quietly, almost like a breath she didn't know she was holding finally being released. It is not an external discovery, nor a dramatic change in circumstance. Nothing around her needs to shift for it to become real. Instead, something within her begins to loosen, as if a long-held misunderstanding is gently dissolving. She begins to understand that she was never broken for needing care. For years, she may have operated under an unspoken assumption that her role was to be strong for everyone else, and that needing support, rest, or understanding somehow made her less worthy. This belief did not always appear as a clear thought. It lived more subtly, in the way she minimized her own struggles, in the way she delayed her needs, in the way she assumed others were more deserving of attention than she was. But now, something shifts. She starts noticing how often she extended compassion outward while withholding it inward. When others struggled, she saw humanity. When she struggled, she saw weakness. When others made mistakes, she saw context. When she made mistakes, she saw flaw. This double standard had lived within her unnoticed for a long time, shaping her relationship with herself in ways she never questioned. And for the first time, she begins to question it. What if needing care was not a failure, but a fundamental part of being human? What if exhaustion was not a flaw, but a signal? What if emotional pain was not something to suppress, but something to listen to? These questions do not demand immediate answers. Instead, they create space. Space for honesty. Space for softness. Space for a more compassionate way of relating to herself. She starts to see that much of her suffering did not come from her needs, but from her resistance to those needs. The effort to appear unaffected, the pressure to stay composed, the habit of pushing through discomfort without acknowledgement. It was not the existence of her emotions that weighed her down, but the loneliness of experiencing them without her own support. Slowly, she begins to shift how she responds to herself. Instead of dismissing fatigue, she acknowledges it. Instead of criticizing emotional reactions, she listens to them. Instead of rushing past discomfort, she allows it to be present without judgment. These changes may seem small from the outside, but internally they are profound. Because every moment she chooses understanding over rejection, she repairs a small fracture in her relationship with herself. She realizes that she had been treating herself as an exception to the very compassion she so freely offered to others. She believed that kindness was something to be earned through endurance, rather than something inherently deserved through existence. But now, that belief begins to soften. She sees that care is not a reward for strength. It is part of what sustains strength. She begins to understand that she is not meant to be endlessly self-sufficient. Human beings were never designed to exist without receiving support, empathy, or rest. Connection is not a luxury, it is a necessity, and she is not outside of that truth. She is included in it. As this understanding deepens, something inside her relaxes. The pressure to always be okay begins to fade. The need to justify her feelings starts to dissolve. She no longer sees herself as someone who must constantly prove resilience in order to deserve gentleness. Instead, she begins to relate to herself as she would to someone she deeply cares about, with patience, with softness, with presence, and in doing so she discovers a quiet but life-altering truth. She was never meant to abandon herself in order to be strong. Her strength was never meant to come from self-denial, but from self-understanding. There comes a final layer of understanding that does not feel like an ending, but more like coming home after a long journey through unfamiliar terrain. It is the kind of realization that does not add something new to the self, but instead removes what was never truly needed. All the roles, expectations, and self-imposed conditions begin to lose their authority. What remains underneath is something simple, steady, and profoundly human. She begins to see that she was never meant to prove her existence through suffering. For so long she may have equated endurance with worthiness. The more she could carry, the more valuable she felt. The more she could suppress her needs, the more responsible she believed she was. Pain became something to normalize rather than question. Exhaustion became something to accept rather than address. And silence became a way of surviving rather than a signal that something essential was missing. But now, this pattern begins to lose its grip. She notices that suffering, when constantly normalized, stops being meaningful and starts becoming invisible. What once required attention becomes background noise. What once signaled imbalance becomes accepted as routine. In this way, a person can live inside a constant state of depletion without ever fully acknowledging it as something that deserves change. And so she begins to ask a different kind of question. Not how do I endure more, but why do I believe I must endure this at all? This question opens a space she may not have visited before. A space where experience is not immediately justified by responsibility or necessity. A space where feelings are allowed to simply exist without being turned into obligations. A space where her internal world is not secondary to external demands. In this space, she begins to see how often she confused suffering with loyalty. How often she believed that staying silent meant being strong. How often she assumed that carrying emotional weight alone was a form of maturity. But now she recognizes that many of these patterns were not expressions of strength, but adaptations shaped by fear, expectation, and habit. And as this recognition deepens, something softens within her. She begins to understand that life was never asking her to disappear in order to fulfill it. Life was never requiring her to reduce herself in order to be accepted. The pressure she felt was not a universal truth, but a learned interpretation of what it meant to be responsible, loved, and good. Slowly, she starts releasing the belief that her value increases through hardship. She sees that her worth does not expand through sacrifice, nor diminish through rest. It remains constant, regardless of output, productivity, or endurance. This realization does not make her less capable. It makes her more aware. Because when a person no longer confuses suffering with meaning, they can finally begin to choose their life rather than merely survive it. She starts noticing small changes in how she moves through the world. She pauses before overextending herself. She listens more closely to discomfort instead of overriding it. She allows space for rest without needing to justify it. These are not dramatic shifts, but they are deeply structural. They begin to reshape her internal foundation, and perhaps the most important realization of all begins to take root quietly within her awareness. She does not need to suffer in order to be significant. She does not need to exhaust herself in order to be loved. She does not need to erase herself in order to belong. Her existence was never meant to be a continuous act of proving. It was meant to be experienced, felt, and lived from a place of wholeness that does not require sacrifice as evidence of value. And in that understanding, she finally steps out of the long illusion that she had to hurt in order to matter, and into the quieter truth that simply being alive has always been enough.